background, but those are helicopters of war doing what they do. Hope you're having a good Friday and that it's peaceful. I can tell you that waking up to the sound of incoming fire and rocket alerts and all that stuff is not glamorous or fun and does not make you a particularly courageous or brave individual just because you happen to be where that's happening. But it does give you a perspective on things. And one of the perspectives that I often think about is the perspective of Bitcoin versus war. And you can love Bitcoin or hate Bitcoin or not think much about it at all. But you can't deny that at its core, Bitcoin is better than war. And by that I mean, war is a terrible thing. Sometimes it is foisted upon us. In fact, always it is foisted upon us, usually by angry old men who have decided to send usually younger men, sometimes women, depending on where you are, to go and fight for their agenda and to die for their agenda and their interests. War is the dumbest human activity. However, when you're defending yourself against an enemy that just seeks your destruction, when you're literally just trying to stay alive in the world where people are just trying to destroy you for no reason other than the fact that you exist, well, war can be a necessary act, and this has massive and often tragic consequences. Bitcoin, on the other hand, does not do that. Right? It's just a commodity and a currency and whatever you want to call it, piece of property. It has a lot of the advantages without a lot of the drawbacks. Now, what are some of the drawbacks of Bitcoin? Well, you can say, oh, it's limited and scarce. Well, you can say that that's a drawback, but other people would say that it's one of its best qualities, right? Why is it a problem for people that it's scarce? Well, it's a problem for people that it's scarce because it means there's only so much that they can possibly have. How can you base your financial system on a scarce resource that has a limited supply and the supply is continually dwindling? Well, that's a good question. It may not be possible to base the entire globe's financial system on that. And personally, I don't think it will happen. Even though I like Bitcoin very much, I don't think the entire globe will be based in Bitcoin at any time. It might happen, but I don't think it will. The reason is the supply of it is not just limited, it's not just scarce, it's already owned by a very tiny number of wallets, okay, of holders. A very, 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 like 13.5 thousand wallets basically own more than 91% of all the Bitcoin there could ever be. how many people own all the fiat? It's more than 13.5 thousand that own more than 90% of the fiat, right? There's 60 million or so, 60 million millionaires and billionaires at least, who together own the vast majority of the fiat, but it's more than 13,500, right? So one problem is it is so scarce, right? And that even if you, again, talking about using Satoshis, even with 2 quadrillion Satoshis available in theory, that is not enough money to base the entire monetary system of the world. Okay? Even if every Satoshi was worth $1, there's more than $2 quadrillion worth of stuff on the earth, right? So it's not really feasible to use Bitcoin as the global financial accounting denomination. Doesn't mean it can never happen at all, but you would have to have the value of a Satoshi be, actually more than $1, which means Bitcoin would have to be worth more than $100 million a piece. And that would mean effectively the dollar would not be a useful measure of account. So at $100 million a piece, the 100 million would be essentially a silly number because nobody would really be using dollars, at least not as the global reserve currency, that's for sure. And the problem is also that there's such a small amount that's available. Right? There's nowhere near 2 quadrillion that are actually 2 quadrillion Satoshis that are in circulation. Right? And the fact is people keep losing more of it as time goes by. People send it to the wrong addresses, or lose their key seed phrases or whatever. It happens. Still happens today. People lose $50 here, $100 there because they lost a seed phrase. Whatever it is, right? It happens. What does that mean? It means that there's a dwindling supply. It's already incredibly scarce, and the supply is dwindling. Right? So it's not enough to keep up with the population growth and the needs of the society that continue to grow in terms of their demand on resources. 2 quadrillion Satoshis is just not enough. Now, does that mean that Bitcoin has no future? No, it does not mean that at all. It can be an incredibly valuable asset. It may, in fact, remain the most valuable asset in some ways. Right? It may become so valuable that it is incredibly high in demand. But that does not mean that it will become the unit of account for the world. Because, again, a unit of account for the world, like a global reserve currency, has to take into account a population growth, has to take into account, a regular increase on demand on resources, has to take into account some measure of inflation, even if we don't like it, has to take into account a whole number of different economic measures that are normal. But even if we got inflation to be at a fixed 2% around the world forever somehow, and it never had to go up or down from there, obviously that's not realistic, but just to give you an example. Why 2%? Well, leading economists, or just economists in general, will tell you that 2% is a target for the economy to keep growing. in a healthy way. So if there's no inflation, then prices never change, and you can have a stagnating economy. Now, of course, inflation is a kind of artificial way of increasing prices and allowing companies to say, oh, we grew by 2% this year. What it really means is they just didn't grow at all. They just benefited from the fact that they're charging 2% more this year than they did last year because of inflation. So, in a way, inflation is not really a necessary device, except that it is, because apart from the sort of artificial inflation, right, there are actually some things that just generally cost more year over. And as time goes by and demand continues to go up, the limited supply gets smaller and smaller, so charging more and more is a logical result that people do. Well, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that having a limited supply asset like Bitcoin is absolutely fantastic in many ways, but it is incapable of dealing with things like long-term inflation issues, right? It's not capable of handling the continual rate of increase on human population and demand on resources. Even if the population were to drop tremendously because of some calamity, heaven forbid, but if it were to happen, right, you would still, after it bottoms out, probabilities are this population would begin to grow again, because that's what people do, right? There are more than 8.2 billion people on the planet right now. Every one of the, I won't say what particular area of the spectrum politically they're on, but let's just say there's a certain segment of the population that's freaking out about low birth rates in certain countries. Isn't it interesting that for decades we were being warned about the risks of overpopulation especially in certain other countries, right? Now, a lot of those same loudmouths are freaking out about low birth rates in other countries. Why? It's almost like they're scared of what would happen if certain countries had less population than certain other countries. Well, my answer to that is, first of all, the world has always had a lower population than it has currently, because we're literally at record highs. Right? 8.2 billion people are alive right now. And, there are certain countries where birth rates are higher than other countries, and a lot of that has to do with education and culture and religion and tradition and all these other things, economic conditions. And while you would think logically that certain people would have less babies given their condition, counterintuitively they're having more. And where you'd think people are having more babies, counterintuitively they're having less. But when you dig past the surface level of the obvious information, you realize the reasons why people have more children in certain countries and less in others. And it's not always very obvious, right? Are there outliers to this where people are actually seeing an expanded population in countries where you would think, oh, that's logical? Yeah, there are. And are there outliers where the opposite is true, where people are having less children in countries where you think they would have less children? Yeah, that's also true. But generally speaking, the counterintuitive thing, the first level counterintuitive thing is happening. But if you dig beneath that surface, it's not really counterintuitive at all. It's quite logical, right? Why there are more people in certain countries as years go by, more and more people at a faster rate. And in other countries, we're seeing slowing population growth at an increasing rate. In some cases, even shrinking population rates at an increasing rate. And it's very logical as to why that's happening once you dig past the surface level of obvious information. So that is why, right, population, for example, is going to continually be a shifting dynamic that affects demand on resources. That is going to affect, obviously, inflation, interest rates, prices, ultimately, are the result of that, right? It's going to affect returns, obviously, which is going to lead to the prices following those returns, right? There's a reason why Bitcoin, as great as it is not really capable of being the the monetary unit of account, right, for all of the economies of the planet and all of the people on Earth. As great as it is, right? And I think it's fantastic. Even Litecoin, right, which has 4 times as many, coins as Bitcoin, right? And I know you can divide your Satoshis into Dekasatoshis or, Centi Satoshis or Milli Satoshis. I get it. You can make far more Satoshis than there are. I get it. Without inflating the number of Bitcoins. Fine. It's possible, right? Yes. You can do that. Right? But the reality is, when you have a limited supply, and already 20 to 25% is gone or inaccessible, people are continuing to lose it over time. So probably by the time Bitcoin stops mining in 120 years, or whatever, 116 years or something, it's going to be, if it's at somewhere between 20 and 25%, add on another anywhere from 1 to 5%, right? It could be as low as like 20, 21. It could be as high as 20, 30%. Who knows what the actual number is? Imagine 30% of an asset is vanished, is gone. And the world has to sustain itself on the other remaining 70%, of which, again, 91% or more of the 100% that could ever be mined is already owned by just the tiniest handful, like less than a hockey arena full of seats, an NHL hockey arena full of seats. And you're going to tell me that is going to be the unit account for the planet? No. That is not a feasible solution. Right? Now you can say, well, again, but there's milli Satoshis. So you can have thousands of, you can break up each Bitcoin not into 100 million, but into 10 billion or whatever, and even more. Yeah, in theory, you could. Which just means that, okay, so that is possible. But when you've already lost a third of it or a quarter of it, and people can keep losing more of it, and there's no way to replenish the lost amount, there's no way to access it again, and that isn't a very good solution. And you can say, well, that's what makes it scarce. Yeah, that is what makes it scarce. And that's why scarce assets that have a limited and dwindling supply are not currently the unit of account for the planet. There's a reason that the world switched from gold to fiat, as much as fiat is not good, and it's not. Because it's infinite money printer and devaluing the fiat currencies, and therefore they will all fail. That's true. But rare, scarce assets also have a problem. Right? They both have problems. So, and the problem is if there isn't enough of a supply of one to be a global reserve currency, then it can't be. That doesn't mean it is incapable of being used as a major currency even. It can be. But to be a global reserve currency, you actually need something that can keep inflating, even at a modest rate, or at least, even if it doesn't inflate more than the population rate or at all, it's able to be divisible, but it's also able to replenish the lost ones in some way. But you would need to be able to prove that they're lost in this and that. Anyway, it is rather complicated. It is one of the things that makes Bitcoin great, actually, is that it is limited and scarce. Like, don't get me twisted on that. It is absolutely incredible because of its essentially adherence to the principles of Austrian economics, as they call it. But that doesn't mean that it's problem-free. Right? It doesn't mean that it will be universally accepted as a solution when it has so many problems. All right, that's it for now. Happy Bitcoin.